I have a bit of a confession to make. You see, I'm romantically in love with 3D platformers. It's easily my favorite genre in gaming, and as someone who isn't big on nostalgia, it's the closest I have to longing for the good old days of gaming. I didn't really take an interest in video games until I got a PS2 for Christmas in, I think it was 2002, and even though I asked for a GameCube, I was far from disappointed. No offense, Mr. GameCube. Along with the console, I got Jak and Daxter, as well as Metal Gear Solid 2, but that's a whole other can of nanomachines. You see, before that, I was used to playing 2D platformers with my sister on her Super Nintendo, so I wasn't just playing on a new console, I was playing with an all-new dimension. The third one. 3D, I mean, whatever. There was just something about taking the 2D platformer and putting it in the third dimension that just really clicked with me. Well, little did I know that that was the golden age of the 3D platformer. Even before the next generation of consoles, the genre would pretty much be dead, passed over in favor of the gray-brown military shooter that dominated the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation. There are a few table scraps here and there, like Sly Cooper Thieves in Time, but I mean that game is considered a financial flop. For the most part, fans of the genre were left with nothing, and we didn't have the same sympathy as those point-and-click adventure fans, I'll tell you that much. They had it easy, I tell you. Anyway, luckily I wasn't the only one who steeped in perpetual rage, sorrow, and disappointment for all that time. Playtonic Games, founded by the pioneers of the genre in the days of the Nintendo 64, have been biding their time. Now, here came those once legendary developers, Steve Mayles, Chris Sutherland, Gavin Price, and Grant Kirkhope, all promising the return of the genre, with a new game called Yooka-Laylee. I didn't back the Kickstarter campaign myself, my own cheapness will always come ahead of everything, but I was still interested. That is, until the game came out and I saw the reviews. Jim Sterling gave it a 2 out of 10, Games Radar and Edge gave it a 6, Polygon a 5.5, and Video Gamer a 4. It's true this game had its fans, but those aren't the kind of scores anybody expected or hoped for. And then I played the game for myself, and you know what? Jim Sterling is absolutely right. Yooka-Laylee just might be one of the worst games of 2017. And thus we get to my real confession. It's not my love for 3D platformers, that I'll gladly admit to. It's that I thought Yooka-Laylee was so bad that I couldn't bring myself to get past the first level. For one thing, expectations were just too high. It was just never going to live up to all that hype. But the thing is, that was never the case for me. I was interested in the game, sure, but I didn't see this as the second coming like so many others had. I think for a lot of people backing the Kickstarter, they were more interested in seeing the return of Rare overall, the company headed by Mayles, Price, Sutherland, and many former Playtonic developers. That whole 3D platformer thing was either a bonus or non-factor for them. For me, I didn't really care about any of that. I enjoyed Rare's games on the Super Nintendo, but they were from a time in gaming where I just didn't care all that much. For me, I viewed Yooka-Laylee as just a thing. I mean, like I said, I was glad the 3D platformer was back, but I didn't really think this was going to be that big of a deal, really. Because again, most people seemed interested in the return of Rare, not 3D platformers. And Playtonic didn't really do themselves any favors by hyping the game up so much as the return of Rare and Banjo-Kazooie anyway. When the Kickstarter campaign was ongoing, I figured that was all just marketing talk. But when I played the game for myself, I was curious, so I went back and played Banjo-Kazooie for the first time. I was stunned. It was like I was playing a graphically inferior Yooka-Laylee. So much of the game was just identical, it was mind-blowing, and that's exactly the problem. Anyone going back and playing Banjo-Kazooie today with a clear and open mind is likely in for a rude awakening. The game holds up, don't get me wrong, it's not awful, but over the last few years, some jank has worked its way into Banjo's toes, and you can't get it out, and it's starting to stink and turn a funny color, and it's just a mess. What's happened is that you've grown up, but the game obviously hasn't. Everyone else who's played those Banjo-Kazooie games has also grown up and have gone on to make their own games. Games that would take the Banjo-Kazooie formula and evolve it, perfected it even. The 3D platformer was at its height, in my opinion, during the days of the PS2 and the GameCube, not the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1. And yet here comes the developers of classic ye olden platformers promising to recreate their classic games with little more than a new coat of paint, as if they've been on ice for all these years. All the progress the genre has made in game design and level design and all of that stuff, all of that progress over the last 20 years or so was completely thrown out by this game. Yooka-Laylee is, by its very design, a 20-year-old game. A game from 1997 trying to compete in the year 2017. Go back and look at the Kickstarter campaign and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The Nintendo 64 duo of Banjo-Kazooie are mentioned no less than 13 times throughout the Kickstarter page alone, not counting the pitch video or any of the updates. The entire team of Playtonic, save for writer Andy Robinson, were all former Rare employees, and given that the story in these games never really had much weight, it's not exactly a big shakeup. The only real innovation mentioned on the Kickstarter page or during the development were the Pages, a collectible that can be used to expand each level, adding new areas to explore, gameplay opportunities, and more stuff to collect. Oddly enough though, that's the one thing that's missing in Yooka-Laylee compared to what was promised on the Kickstarter page. The idea of using Pages to expand worlds just doesn't really work anything like that. It was always evident that this was the one area of their pitch that they didn't quite have nailed down yet, speaking only vaguely about how you could expand worlds like in a book. In reality though, all you really do is spin those Pages like any other form of currency to enter previously locked sections of the game world. There's nothing unique about that. Worst of all, you need to collect all 100 of them before you're allowed to enter the boss area. Yeah, you can get to the final boss fight if you don't have all the Pages, but you can't activate the boss unless you have all 100, thus you can't beat the game either. And that is exactly what I mean when I say Yooka-Laylee is devoted to nostalgia. Having to arbitrarily collect 100 collectibles just to beat the game doesn't really fly anymore. It just doesn't. Yooka-Laylee is full of contrived rules just like this one, designed to pad out the game time as well as mind-numbingly old-fashioned gameplay mechanics, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's start with the biggest issue this game has. The second biggest, it's hard to say, the camera. Yooka-Laylee's camera has a mind of its own. It flings itself at terminal velocity around the game world seemingly at random, completely divorced of where you actually are. You allegedly have control over it with the right analog stick, but once you're done adjusting it, it'll immediately wander off again like a bored child out shopping with their mom. And it's way too close to you, so it can be hard seeing what's going on around you most of the time, a debilitating issue for a game about jumping over bottomless pits. There's also this weird thing where whenever you enter new areas, the camera will spin around and face the camera, so you have to spin it right back around behind yourself. Again, this is just like a Banjo-Kazooie game, and that just doesn't really work anymore. We have 2 analog sticks now. We can freely control the camera as we like. You don't have to do this. And the camera issues are made all the worse by the truly horrific jumping physics. This feels, once again, like a Nintendo 64 game in that there kind of really aren't any physics, just 3D models being hurled around at random based on how the programmers think they should act. Starting a jump feels like you've got 2 cinder blocks attached to each foot, ever eager to drag you down bottomless pits, some of which you can't even see before it's too late. But once you get off the ground and are in mid-air, there's a complete 180, and you feel like you're a balloon that's about to float away. Walking feels like you're ice skating, rolling feels like you're an 18-wheeler ice skating, and your attacks are so floaty you'll want to grab those cinder blocks off Yuka's feet and strap them to your controller to make sure it doesn't fly off. Speaking of attacks, there is combat in the game. Despite this not being Yooka-Kazooie's biggest issue, it does serve as the best illustration of how far behind Playtonic's game design philosophy is. Do you know how the combat works in this game? Let me tell you. You stand in one spot, constantly hitting the attack button until everything else is dead. Oh sure, you can move and attack if you want to spice things up, but there's no need to. Enemies only need 1 hit to kill, and they're all more than happy to run straight at you, never changing up their strategy, never reacting to what you're doing, never dodging, never trying anything different, never doing anything other than marching to their deaths. Compare this with later 3D platformers like Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, and even later Sly Cooper games, and it becomes downright embarrassing. We now come up to the part of the game that I hate the most. It's not the most egregious bit of the game. In fact, if it were implemented better, I think I might have kind of liked it. But as it is in the game now, this is exactly what made me quit after the very first level. At the end of each level, there's a TV game show quiz that you have to play. That's right, the game quizzes you about the level you just played, and you have to get an ungodly number of random questions right about each level. What's the name of the first enemy you killed? How many enemies do you fight in this area? How many blades of grass make up the first level? They're asinine questions that I'm convinced you can only get right by guessing, and no, you can't look up the answers online because they're all randomly generated. I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be one big joke. It would fit in line with this game's idea of humor. This is a game that's more than willing to point to some underwear and slap you up the back, yucking it up and asking you if it's funny in a way that makes it clear he's already got the answer. I wouldn't be surprised if the game were to quote one of Larry the Cable Guy's fart jokes, only to illustrate how they could have done a better job telling the joke by actually farting it themselves. It's the most childish humor presented in the most unfunny way. There's no setup to any of it, it just throws a cheesy reference to another game at you, or it does what it doubtlessly thinks is edgy political satire and moves on just as quickly, probably hoping you won't notice. To be fair, you probably won't get it because the voice acting is genuinely gut-wrenching, and I don't mean it's an emotional roller coaster. I mean you're going to need a bucket close at hand to simply listen to most of it. Every word, every syllable, every letter is coughed, spat, hacked, spewed, expelled, sneezed, gagged, and vomited out in achingly disgusting noises. If they don't sound disgusting, then they probably sound perverted, like Yooka himself. Yes, they introduced an update that we'll talk more about in a bit that lets you skip these voices and even turn them off, but when a developer gets to the point where they need to create a feature that lets you skip certain aspects of their game, it's pretty clear that even they realize they screwed up. But let's be real, it's not like the story warrants any grandiose voice acting anyway. The plot is as simple as they come. The villain has stolen your book and you want to get it back. The end, that's it. Pack it up, that's all there is to see here. Your main characters are too stupid to go look for another book or do anything else. It's not all that surprising though, given that Laylee is one of the most unlikable video game characters I have ever seen. We're supposed to be rooting for this person, and yet she insults every single character you meet throughout the game, right to their face, usually when they're expressing some level of concern or sorrow over something. And did I mention the terrible voice acting? Every level is clearly designed in such a video gamey way. Again, I only played the first level, but I don't need to play to know that generic ice world, generic swamp world, and generic tropical world are far from inspired concepts. And there's no thought put into how these levels would actually work. I know this might sound petty, but stick with me here. Let's compare one of the later levels, Capital Casino, with one in Sly Cooper on the PS2, Boneyard Casino. In Sly Cooper, you start the level outside the casino and have to sneak your way in at night. Once you get in, you'll find that there is a ton of security guards. You've got gun turrets, guards with spotlights, multiple paths, sections designed for stealth, and of course all the scenery like slot machines and the giant spinning windmill, poker tables, and a whole lot more. There are doors and tables and hallways in sensible places. This doesn't feel like a level in a video game, it feels like you're sneaking into a real, functioning casino, and that just adds even more to the story and the world. Compare that to Capital Casino, and it's so obvious this place was designed to just be a video game level, it's painful. How the hell are people visiting this place supposed to get up here? Or up here? Where are all the doors and the walkways? No thought was put into any of this, and that extends over to the placement of collectibles, platforms, and enemies. Every collectible is put in the hardest to reach places simply to give you a challenge, so you never feel like you're progressing in levels, and you never feel like you're in a real world location. That's made worse by the fact that every level is semi-open, and there's no indication of where you're supposed to be going. I'm as big a fan of a game not holding my hand as the next person, but just throwing a player into an open world without giving them the slightest clue of what they're supposed to be doing or why is just ridiculous. If you're patient enough, you may eventually run into two things: boss battles and minigames, and God help you if you do. Here's my experience with the Great Rampo, the only boss battle I encountered before I quit. You need to roll up the ramp and hit him in the face, but he's constantly spitting logs out at you. However, you have no idea where the logs are coming from because our old friend the shitty camera is back. In this fight, your biggest enemy is the camera, which is constantly pointing at a downward angle so you can't see where the logs are coming from until it's too late. Whenever you get hit by one of these logs, you fall all the way back down, at which point the camera spasms out of control, sometimes spinning a full 360 degrees before finally cottoning on to what you're trying to do. Twice I died by accidentally walking off the ledge at the bottom of the ramp because the camera wouldn't stop spinning around and confusing the hell out of me. Then there are the arcade minigames, which controlled so poorly I'm just gonna let you watch this clip of the racing game I played before I quit that too. Oh, this is getting far too depressing for me, and there's still a lot of ground to cover, so I'll just give you the highlights of what's left. The hub world is laid out in such a confusing way it might be one of the worst in gaming history. The upgrades you can buy are either totally useless or essential to the point where the game should have started you with them to begin with, and the shooting sections are probably worse than any Game Boy Advance first-person shooter you may have ever played. To their credit, Playtonic did address these issues. In June, a massive update came out for the PC version, and a couple months later for consoles, that adjusted the camera, gives you no less than 4 different ways to skip the cutscenes and voice acting, fixes bugs, and adds a few tiny tweaks here and there, like providing literal signposts in the hub world. The small tweaks like the signposts and the improved arcade controls are good, and I gotta say, I love being able to mute the atrocious voice acting. However, the highly touted manual camera controls aren't really much of an improvement. The camera is still too close to you, it's still too loose no matter how low you turn the sensitivity, and worst of all, it's still not 100% manually controlled. It'll still start facing you whenever you enter new areas, only to automatically spin back behind you on its own. Whoop-de-freaking-do. Ugh, god, this is actually kind of worse in some ways. Playtonic makes a big deal on their website about how they listen to feedback regarding the patch from PC gamers, but if that's the case, I gotta say they must not have listened very well because these controls are still total garbage. And of course, the update does absolutely nothing at all for the jumping or general movement physics, so the game still feels terrible to play. Does the update make the game better? Yes, the game is better after this update. Does it make it a good game? Absolutely not. When I first played Yooka-Laylee, I genuinely thought this was the final nail in the coffin for the 3D platformer. The game was supposed to be the triumphant return of the genre made by the people who pioneered it, but it was terrible and got reviews to match that quality. With all the hype surrounding this thing before launch, and the epic way it came crashing down, I thought every developer this side of Haven City would cut and run and stick with easier to make and more popular 2D platformers, and I was devastated. But something strange happened, something magical. 2017 actually turned out to be a great year for the genre. We got Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, Snake Pass, Skylar and Plux, Super Lucky's Tale, Unbox, A Hat in Time, and Voodoo Vince Remastered, all of which were pretty damn good, some even great. The future is looking okay, if not spectacular, for 3D platformers. The glorious resurgence in 2017 doesn't look like it's going to carry over into this new year, but we still have a few games to look forward to like Happy Hell, Funk Unplugged, and maybe even Clive and Wrench. Oh, and Lobo Destroyo, but that's a whole other can of worms. There's even a rumor we'll get a remaster of the original Spyro trilogy this year too. I'm actually more curious about what Playtonic will do going forward. I think they'll continue making spiritual successors to their other older games, but I think it's just as likely they make a sequel to Yooka-Laylee. The real question is if they ever try to use crowdfunding again, because if they do, I have a feeling they're not going to get quite as warm a reception as last time. But after all this whining and complaining, I genuinely do hope they manage to turn things around and make a great game in the future. I don't want to ever have to keep trashing 3D platformers like this. I hate it, almost as much as I hate Yooka-Laylee. Support us on patreon.com/Clickist for more videos just like this, or visit us at clickist.com for all the latest news, reviews, investigations, interviews, and opinion pieces on indie gaming. Thank you.